Hi, today's tutorial we're going to be going over a chameleon, a step-by-step guide. You can find the reference photo listed in the comments below. So for step 1 here, we're going to need the reference photo, and we're going to be covering the basic shapes. So it's easiest if you just trace over your reference photo and then go from there. So a nice bright color would probably be best. That way it stands out from your background. Please do this on another layer, that way you can turn it off and on. So as you can see here, I'm breaking it down into really simple shapes. A bunch of circles, a bunch of squares, a bunch of just curved lines. And we're going to replicate that on our canvas. So create a new layer and try and replicate those basic shapes. And think about how those shapes relate to each other in terms of size. That way you can get those proportions down before you start drawing in any details. As we come to a close with our basic shapes, we can then proceed to lower the opacity so we can still see it and create a new layer to make our sketch layer. And that'll bring us to step 2. So this is our basic sketch. This is not our line art. This is just putting down all those details that we want to convey. You can be as detailed as you want. You can be as basic as you want. It really depends on what kind of style you're going for. As we come down to the tail, you can see that this is a little bit more of a complex shape. So I'm going to go back to my reference here, and then I'm going to outline these little half moons in order to make it a little bit more understandable to recreate. As we wrap up this little sketch layer here, we're going to go into our next step, which is outlining the pattern shapes. So for this, we're just going to quickly block in the prominent designs on the chameleon. You can add as much of the detail as you want, or make it a little bit more limited if you wanted to make it a little bit more stylized. But for each of the colors, I like to make a different layer and make a different color to make it obvious which patterns are which, and then I will recreate it over here on my canvas. Helpful tip here to get the pattern base down is, as I'll highlight here, is to make some marker points on where these patterns stop and start and how they relate to each other, including markers for how far away they are from other items and the curvature along the body. That way you can place them a little bit easier. We'll go ahead and slide into the next step, which is the line art layer. So for this layer, you want to take your time and you want to lay down those lines as clean as you can, unless you're going for more of a sketchy look. And just, think about what style you're going for. So this tutorial is a little bit more of a pop art style, so I'm going to keep those big black lines. But if you like it thinner, or if you want the color to match the color of your chameleon's body, you can always change that color later. by clicking the little checkerboard next to the lock under layers, and you can recolor your line art at any time. As you wrap up your line art and you get it where you're satisfied, we're going to go ahead and move to coloring it. So first off, you want to pick your base color, and you're going to fill in all of your base, and you only have to do this once, where you have to cut out all of the excess, because we're going to be using a tool called a clipping mask. So take your time cutting it out, make sure you're really close to the lines. And you can always recolor this layer later using the same tool that I just showed you before by locking that layer. As we wrap up cutting out our base color layer here, in order to make a clipping mask, you're going to create a new layer for your patterns, and you're going to right click that layer and select clipping mask. We're going to put our pattern base over top of this in order to still see the outlines and put it on a low opacity, and then we will color in on our new clipping mask layer our pattern lines. So a clipping mask basically just allows you to draw within the boundaries that you have set of the layer that's beneath your clipping mask layer. Just remember that because you have a layer over top of this, it's going to change the color and make it a little bit darker, but you can always turn that layer of the pattern base on and off by clicking the little eyeball next to the layer. For the next color that I'm going to choose, I'm going to make a new clipping mask layer, and for this I'm going to take my darker color of choice, and I'm going to create one layer over top the yellow and one layer under the yellow. That way I can do those middle layers that are on the body underneath the yellow lines and make it a little bit more continuous and clean. So I'm going to eyeball the eye here, sorry for that pun. And it's kind of like a peppermint kind of pattern, so I'm just going to wing it, but you can feel free to do what we did with the basic shapes at the beginning and go over the reference photo and outline those patterns in block colors if it makes it a lot easier for you. You can see here I'm adding another little base layer for a reference guide in order to put in a little bit more complex of a design here. on the overtop layer. And here's where I'm going to go underneath with that other layer for my dark color. That way I can make a continuous look without having to clean up really close to those lines. I put the original base layer on invisible, that way I don't have to see it anymore. And I decided that I didn't really care for the blue that I chose and that I would go for more of a brown. And so I locked those dark pattern layers in order to recolor them really quickly. Okay, here I start messing around with different ways I'm going to color this. I'm using a gradient here, but I decided it wasn't quite the look that I was going for, but that is one way that you can shade your item. I'm of course just messing around right now, but I will specifically tell you how to shade. I'm going to go with a style here soon that I decide I like on the yellow layer, but I'm going to recreate that layer in a way that makes it easier for you guys to color the chameleon as a whole. So this is another way you can color, and this is an airbrush design to get a little bit more of a gradient, but in more specific areas. I mean, art is really about experimentation, so whatever looks good to you, that's what's important. So here I erase it all, and I'm going to go with a style that's very, people tend to call it cell shading, and I decided that this is the look that I'm gonna go for this tutorial because it's an easy way to shade for everyone. You're basically just cutting out block shapes of the shading, and you can imply different areas like I am here with the wrinkles through just basic shapes instead of having to put line art everywhere. For the sake of this tutorial, you can completely ignore my experimentation here, and for the shading, I will let you know later when to start. Okay, for the next step of this tutorial, we're going to put in the details. So you can take a texture brush if you want. I'm just going to take the basic hard round brush because it's what everybody has in their, brush folder. And I'm going to create a new layer over top everything, and I am going to start putting in some of those dotted patterns. I created another layer underneath the dark brown layer. That way I could get that circle of blue within the eye, and you can layer as much as you want. Mess around, screw around, find out. I mean, that's the best way to figure out what looks good. If you want to avoid the Swiss cheese look here, you can easily just wiggle those lines on the side to make it a little bit less straight and defined. As we wrap up our detail work, we can go ahead and start the new layer, which is going to be the shade layer. So go ahead and make a new layer, clipping mask that, and we're going to pick a cool tone color because generally shadows are a cooler tone. And I'm just going to go with a basic blue here, and I am going to pretty much fake some directional light here because this chameleon is kind of have some ambient light and no real directional light because it's probably cloudy out. So I'm going to make up some shading here. You can of course do some gradients or some airbrushing if you want a more ambient light look, or you can pretend where the light source is and fill in some general shading. As I wrap up where I want my shading to go, I'm going to lower the opacity. You can leave it like this if you prefer your shading to look a little bit more like this, but I'm going to clean up and I'm going to mess with the filters. So under the layer, you can see there is a pull down menu and it should be set to normal right now. And with that, you can change it and go through all the different filters and pick out one that you like. For this one, I think I end up settling on subtract, but of course it's all, you know, up to you. I like the poppy colors that I get with this one, so I'm just gonna go with that one. Usually I just go with a lower opacity for certain things, but I do actually like this filter quite a lot on this. I'm gonna go back in and fix a little bit of shading where I want some more. Next, I'm going to make a new layer and we're going to do our highlights. So for this, I'm just going to take a basic white and I'm going to add in some of the highlights on the areas that would catch more sun. You have to remember that most animals are 3D, they do have dimensions to it, so try not to just do the outer lines, otherwise it'll kind of look like it's more embossed and a flat object than a little bit more three-dimensional. So try to figure out what areas are meatier, like this tail here, or the main body, and try and put those highlights more on the body than on the edges, and that will help make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. We're then going to take the opacity and lower it down. That way it just ends up looking like a lighter color. You can mess with the filter layers again here in order to get some more funner colors in order to pop out, but it's all up to you and what you like. So when adding in your own directional light, one thing I see people do a lot is draw these little three-dimensional arrows on where we think our sunlight's coming from. And direct light means it has a very strong contrast between the highlights and the darks. So this is my arrow here, and then I'm going to give you an example on the kind of lighting in this scenario. So it's probably cloudy or highly, vegetated in this area for this chameleon, and that's why it has ambient light versus, a sun with direct light and no clouds, nothing in the way. It's going to give a stronger shadow like you would see here. So if you add a cloud, then you're going to have a much softer shadow, which I did kind of a poor job here, but I think you might see what I'm getting at. It takes a little bit of practice, but if you look at from nature, you'll start picking up where those shadows are going to end up going on all sorts of types of objects. Lastly, I'm going to put in the branch because I kind of forgot to do this earlier, so I'm going to do the same step process as before. I'm going to make that sketch layer, I'm going to put in the lines and where I think looks good, put in the base color, and then I'll probably cut out the other base colors from that and add in a shading layer and a highlight layer. Just remember when choosing your shadows and your highlights, try to go for a cool tone for the shadow and a warmer tone for the highlight. In nature, you'll find that this is what generally looks more correct than just going higher in saturation or lower in saturation. You can also do a little bit of hue shift to give it a little bit more interest, but in order to add texture here, I just added in some dots to make it a little bit more textured rather than, you know, a very smooth branch. And I'm just taking in those different color layers and overlapping them a little bit. As we wrap up here, I'm going to go ahead and crop it down to a size that I like, and then I'm going to throw in a simple background. If you like these tutorials, feel free to comment on what kind of animals or objects you'd like to see a tutorial of. I'm going to try to do beginner and intermediate and advanced courses. That way you can pick whatever suits you best. And for the intermediate courses, you know, they'll have a few more tools involved and a little bit harder techniques, and advanced courses, of course, will include a lot more blending and things like that, color theory. But beginner courses, keep it simple. Remember, don't forget to sign your name because it is your artwork. And feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks!